ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the folks that are joining us today. Masie Cochran is the editorial director at Tin House. She's worked on a wide range of award-winning and best-selling titles, including Claire Fuller's novels, which also includes her forthcoming novel, Unsettled Ground. She's also worked on The Magical Language of Others by E.J. Coe, a favorite here at Green Apple, The Seas by Samantha Hunt, Rabbit Cake by Annie Hartnett, Who is Vera Kelly by Rosalie Knecht, and Ruth Gilligan, among others. Forthcoming authors include Betsy Bonner, Maria Jose Ferrada, Natalie Bakopoulos, and Jennifer Nasabuga Mukumbi. Before coming to Tin House, she worked at Inkwell Management Literary Agency in New York. Please welcome Masie Cochran.
Hi, everybody.
Additionally, we're also joined by Ruth Gilligan, who's a writer and academic from Dublin, now based in the UK. She's published 5 books to date, including Forget and Ninefold Make a Paper Swan, and was the youngest person ever to top the Irish bestseller list. Ruth holds degrees from Cambridge, Yale, UEA, and Exeter. She contributes literary reviews to the Irish Independent, Guardian, TLS, and LA Review of Books. She works as a senior lecturer in creative writing at the University of Birmingham and is an ambassador for the global storytelling charity Narrative 4. Her latest novel, The Butcher's Blessing, is the reason we are here today. So please join me in welcoming Ruth Gilligan.
Hello. Thanks, Car. And yes, thanks so much for having me. This is just such a joy to be here. The book came out obviously in America on Tuesday, so it's been a really exciting week. And so it's nice to do something to market. And you know, when Tin House got in touch about doing this event, I was like, I've been to Green Apple Books, which is always really exciting because there are many bookshops in America and I've not been to all of them. So it's such a pleasure to get invited to do something with the bookshop that I have been to and visited, and hopefully I think bought books from. So I'm sure. So yeah, no, it's lovely to be here, and thanks for joining us. Masie has asked me before we get into our chat, which I'm really looking forward to, just to do a short reading from The Butcher's Blessing, which I will do with pleasure. And especially for those of you who haven't read it or have no idea what it's about, hopefully this will be a good way to kind of set the scene before we start nattering about it. This is also very exciting. I haven't actually done a reading from the American version yet, so it feels very different in my hand, which is quite a pleasure. So I'm just going to read like a short section, as I said, to get us going. Good readings need no introduction, but just a tiny little bit of introduction. The novel basically centers around this group of 8 men called the Butchers, who travel around Ireland killing cows according to an ancient folklore. And that's kind of at the core of the novel. But really what the book follows is not the butchers themselves on their travels, but the people they leave behind while they travel across the country, and crucially the women that they leave behind, so their wives and their daughters and their lovers, who are left, in their wake. So the book focuses a lot on a character called Oona, who's one of the butcher's daughters. And I'm just going to read a short scene where Oona is bidding farewell to her father as he heads out on his travels for the next 11 months, and she's sad to see him go. The dawn was barely cracked when the time came for departure. Her father would walk to a crossroads about a mile down the road where the others would be waiting with their horses and carts. Sometimes her mother, for a joke, suggested that butchers should drive, should invest in a minivan. They say Ireland's getting more modern by the day. Why not keep up with the times? But Oona knew better than to laugh at that joke. Nothing about the old ritual was allowed to change. Her mother hovered next to her now on the front steps, the pair of them sheathed in their dressing gown furs. The air outside was well below freezing, making white of their goodbye breaths. "You're a gorgeous girl," her father croaked as he leaned down for a kiss. It took all her strength not to beg him to stay. The butcher embraced his wife one last time, then ambled slowly out the gate. He looked so giant as he moved, big enough to be a myth himself. The fields around were raw with silence, the hillsides stony pocked and sparse. It was a wonder anything would ever grow again. And Oona was so distracted, she almost forgot. "Love, your shoe." But as soon as her mother spoke, she took her slipper from her foot and flung it hard, watched it arc through the air, then land in the shimmering frost. It was another custom, meant to wish him luck on his travels. Her father didn't turn, only removed his hand from the pockets of his overalls and raised it high in acknowledgement. Oona stayed out on the doorstep watching, her left foot slowly going numb until she saw the man shape blacken, then shrink, then disappear. Eventually, her white breath faded too as the moon bowed out and the sun arrived instead, hurling itself cold and radiant into the morning sky. Ta-da!
Thank you, Ruth. That was beautiful. I love hearing you read from this book. Well, to jump in, you know, maybe I'll start with the very first time I read this, when I acquired it. And you'd been a Tin House author before, but you'd worked with Meg's story on Nine Folds. And when I first read this, I was absolutely transported. I read it from, you know, sort of, you read it from a computer screen, you know, sitting at your desk. But I read about 40 to 50 pages in that first gulp. And I just couldn't get over how transporting it was, how, you know, deftly you just described this world, how full of storytelling and folklore and characters. And I'm curious, I've never asked you this, you know, and it wasn't in your author questionnaire, but I'm curious, like, how did this book first begin for you? Was it an image? Was it a character? Was it the story, you know, of we call it mad cow disease? What was the igniting idea here?
Yeah, I mean, like all books, right? There's like various things going on in your brain or in your consciousness. And then there is just that thing that suddenly brings it all together. So I think for like a long time, I'd been pretty obsessed with kind of Irish folklore and old traditions, and how, you know, a lot of people talk about Ireland being such a religious country, but there is also this kind of pagan almost history and these superstitions and religions and folklores that like many people in the country like still cleave to, or at least are aware of, and that's like a whole other kind of faith and belief system that goes on in Ireland. So that was always something that like I was really fascinated in and wanted to write about. But honestly, in terms of like the cow side of things and like what ultimately gave birth to like the butchers, was I was on a road trip with a friend of mine whose father is a farm animal vet, and as you do on long road trips, when you run out of things to talk about, you really kind of scrape the barrel. So he started telling me about he just started telling me some funny stories about like his dad working as a farm animal vet in Ireland, and especially in the 90s, and when mad cow disease was going on, and just these like mad stories that I was like, this is just all sounds a bit nuts, and kind of dodgy dealings going on, and especially around the border, and just this whole kind of world of farm scandal and mystery, and you know, almost like the beef mafia, and I just thought it was like amazing. So this kind of like sparked something in me, as I said, and then I guess the like folklore side of things and the kind of beef cow mad cow disease things, I was like, maybe these belong together, which doesn't seem like an obvious fit, but yeah, we made it work.
That's so great. I've had lots of readers and booksellers ask me, you know, oh, the butchers, you know, the 8 fabled butchers at the center of this narrative, they're so amazing. I didn't know about them. And I don't have the heart to tell them sometimes that the butchers write their work of fiction. You know, it's a novel, and even though lots of it is informed by history or research, these 8 butchers themselves, and in a way that sort of enhances the folklore of it, that blend of fact and fiction. But have you found that readers are inclined to believe that the butchers are drawn from history, like they're a real group of these 8 men?
Yeah, they're like, and it's kind of the first question I'm ever asked is like, are the butchers real? And I think it's quite a like fascinating question in and of itself, because I'm kind of like, well, what do you mean by real? Because we're like acknowledging that they are, you know, the beliefs they follow are superstitions or a folklore or whatever. So obviously it's not real, but like people have a real obsession with knowing whether they are like an invention or whether they are like a pre-existing set of kind of beliefs or folklores, and you know, they are an invention, I guess, but like they also are kind of more like an amalgamation of stuff I found when I was doing my research. Because as I said, I had in mind that I wanted to write a book that is about kind of Irish myth and folklore and superstition. And then I also weirdly wanted to write a book about cows and the mad cow disease crisis. So I started like researching the Venn diagram where those two things meet. And there are just like an insane amount of old superstitions around cows and you know, people like, you know, tying knots in their cows' tails for good luck, or like burning herbs under their nose before they killed them. So there were all these like weird little bits of folklore and superstition, which I kind of just mangled together to create the Butchers. But yeah, so they are an invention. And you're right that like people, it's kind of the first question I'm always asked. And I mean, my British editor, for example, he didn't know that they weren't, like he thought they were real until really late in the day. Like it was like the final batch of edits, and we were trying to like get our heads around this one kind of plot hole that we just couldn't quite make work. So I was like, James, don't worry about it, I'll just change this one thing about the Butchers and then it will all fit. And he was like, but you can't do that. And I was like, oh my God, he doesn't know. I was like, James, you know that they are like a fabrication of mine. And he was like mind blown. Like he just couldn't. We were working on this book for like 6 months together. And he was like, I had no idea. But I guess people not from Ireland just assume it's like an Irish thing that they've never heard of. And yeah, so I think it's quite fascinating that people, yeah.
But I think it's also a testament to the writing, because you do believe, because of all of the details, you know, like when you said about tying knots in the cow's tail for good luck, like there's a scene I remember where he's like looking at cows at auction, and there's a cow that has like a strange gait. And he's like, oh, that cow will produce sweeter milk. You know, is that a true thing?
But that is exactly, that's like something that I found somewhere. So yeah, there are like all these things peppered in that are, and again, I feel really not reticent, but it feels odd to use the phrase real, because like we know that that's not. But yeah, so it, and I think, but that for me is kind of wonderful as well, because the book is all about like a dying set of beliefs and people kind of confronting with like, well, what do I actually believe in? And do I want to still cleave to this kind of ancient, slightly pagan past, or do I want to leave that behind? So for me, if that almost is like the effect it has on the reader as they too try to figure out, do I think this is genuine or real or true or whatever word you want to use or not? I kind of like the idea that they are having that same like, not quite sure as some of the characters are.
Yeah. I think another thing that's kind of funny, you've had sort of serendipities in this way, is that another thing your book has sort of been praised for, right, is how timely it is because of COVID. And, you know, you've got COVID-19 looming over the global landscape. And that's kind of the magic of reading and book creation, because this novel was well in the works, you know, the writing and the rewriting stages much earlier. And so I'm curious if you can speak to like, you know, that's another level, it almost seems, of this sort of like folklore, is that you have a book that deals with a pandemic that has come out during a pandemic. And do you see any sort of unplanned parallels? Do you see readers kind of finding things in our current moment here with this book? You know, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's been really weird also, because so in truth, like when I was writing the book, I was aware that like potentially the book was going to be timely, because basically the whole book is set along the Northern Irish border. And like, you know, obviously we had like the Brexit referendum here in the UK in 2016, and then the fallout from that, and everyone was suddenly talking about the border in a way that they haven't for a very long time, and all eyes were kind of on that. And you know, as I said, with the portions of the book that are focused on the kind of farmers and the meat industry, or I said like the kind of dodgy dealings, there's like cattle smuggling over the border. And this is at a time when in the news they were talking about like the logistics post-Brexit of getting goods and people over the border in Northern Ireland. So as I was writing, I was like, wow, this is gonna feel super topical in a way that like I'm not doing it for that reason, but I could anticipate, I guess, that like when the book finally came out, and we all know that like, as you know, I spent ages writing my books, mainly because I just get totally distracted by all the lovely research. But yeah, you do know that whatever that is, presumably that will be the kind of question that comes up. So then to publish the book, as you said, in 2020, and like the book, you know, it came out in the UK and Ireland like on March 26th, which, so it was kind of like 4 days into lockdown number 1. So it was like right on the cusp, like still in that moment when we were all just like, sorry, what is going on? As in, like, we thought until really late in the day that like both the London and the Dublin launches would be going ahead in person, because we were still trying to, like, we just didn't know if that was still a thing or not. So yeah, it has been kind of mad that then by the time the book actually came out, the conversation, as you said, has switched to like, wow, your book's really timely, but no one's mentioned the border once. No one wants to talk about that. They're like, wow, you've written a pandemic book. Let's talk about that. And for me also, like the really interesting thing, because people are always asking about parallels, and in a way, I don't know if they're also like, do you have any wisdom? And I'm like, no, I'm also just as dazed and confused by this year as everyone else. So I don't pretend, because I've written a book that's set during mad cow disease, I suddenly have like anything particularly profound to offer. I think what is really interesting is like, you know, the book is, because of the way the mad cow disease crisis played out, it was like way worse in Britain, and the farmers in Ireland were like, haha, this could be our opportunity to like swoop in and make some money because we're fine and we can make the most of this, and this is our chance to get one up on England, our old rivals, etc., etc. So that's the only kind of thing that has really struck me, is because similarly, you know, the way that the kind of UK has dealt with and been hit by COVID versus Ireland is quite interesting, and those parallels. And as someone who kind of every morning reads like The Guardian and then the Irish Times, being able to see the difference between the coverage and the conversations that are happening, definitely kind of, that is the one thing that I definitely can see in terms of like the stuff in the book versus the stuff that's happening right now. But other than that, I have like 0 words of wisdom to impart, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, because I remember when we acquired the book, we had no idea about COVID. And then lots of readers saying, oh, you know, this was really interesting to me, this idea of, you know, a global pandemic. And even many reviews, as you've noticed, have talked about, you know, it being about a pandemic. Well, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, because when I was working, getting ready for this interview, I've happened on like one of your essays that you wrote for Tin House a couple years ago, talking about the interweaver, which I think is I think you've created this word, interweaver, which I think is really brilliant, because you talk about it as being a multi-stranded, polyvocal, perspective shifting voice, right? Where all these narrative strands kind of come together to form a like a whole story. And you call this idea, this way of telling stories, interweaver. And what's really wonderful is that The Butcher's Blessing really perfectly fits this description of a book, you know, many years ago that you described as an interweaver, because here you have a choral narrative, 4 points of view, all very different, a mother, a daughter, a father, a son. And I'm really curious sort of why you were drawn to telling this story, revealing the story in this way.
Yeah, I mean, apart from just like to make life really bloody difficult for myself, yeah, sure. I mean, that essay, like when I wrote it, yeah, God, good find. That was a while ago. But I mean, you know, the shortest answer to offer is that like those are the books I love. Like I love reading novels that have multiple narrators and multiple points of view. And I just, the way that they kind of interweave, and the way that you often get like different perspectives on the same scene, the same moment, getting different voices. I love that. And then seeing, you know, there's always some question mark about how it's all going to link up, and then it does, and you're like, hurrah, that was satisfying. Like I just, those tend to be anyway the novels that I prefer. Also, like frankly, I find the idea of like starting with one character on page 1 and just writing, like sticking with them for 300 pages, like that terrifies me as a prospect, as a writer, like that for me, because I just like, how do you not get bored, or like how do you not get sick of this person? Whereas like, as far as I'm concerned, if you're switching around to different narrators, you can kind of just like stick with them while something juicy and interesting is happening, and then as soon as like it's not. You can switch to someone else. So in a way, it's like a greatest hits reel. I think also, you know, fundamentally, and I kind of alluded to this when I was introducing my reading, I think when I knew that I wanted to write a book that was centered around this group of men called the Butchers, and I've seen a couple of reviews who are like, it's really frustrating that we don't get the Butchers' points of view. And I'm like, no, that's the whole point. Because I just think, you know, they are shrouded in mystery and otherness, and they become in many ways just like a projection for people's hopes and faiths, and also hostilities and like I guess intolerance. You know, they become a projection, and I kind of wanted to keep them elusive, but also because they're 8 dudes, and like within the kind of canon of like Irish books set in the countryside, like there's a lot of stories about dudes, and I was really interested in, like, as I said at the start, like this idea of the people they leave behind, and specifically like their wives and their daughters and their lovers and these female voices. So sorry, this is slightly long-winded answer, but I think the voices around the Butchers was what was interesting to me. And then, you know, there used to be slightly even more perspectives, if you can believe it, because I guess when I was first starting off, I was trying all these different ones, and then I kind of settled out, as you said, with a mother and a daughter and a father and a son, and that suddenly felt really perfect for, again, what the book is about, especially because it is about, you know, the past versus the future, and progress versus tradition, and what we choose to kind of carry on through generations, and what perhaps we choose to leave behind. So having those kind of a parent and their child felt really important, to the point that, like, I remember at one point, like, one of those 4 just like wasn't working. Like, I was finding it really difficult, and you know, my British editor kind of said to me, like, you know, maybe we just get rid of him. But then the whole thing would have been, that beautiful symmetry just would have been, you know, skewed, and it wouldn't have worked. So I was just like, no, we're going to make it work. It has to be the 4, because now that I'm wedded to this, I am. So so yeah, it was really fun to write. I should say, as like a coda to the world's longest answer ever, is that like the book I'm working on now, further to everything I've just said, and again, trying to make life difficult for myself, I have forced myself to only have one narrator, and I stick with one person the whole time. But I basically cheated, because that is still so terrifying to me. So it jumps around in time a lot, because again, just sticking with her from day one and going forward, just like, I don't know how you make that interesting for 300 pages. So yeah, I've sort of cheated, but that is the next challenge.
Oh, wow. I'm going to use every bit of restraint that I have, not to be like, let's talk about your next book. Not because I haven't read it yet. I haven't seen a single page yet. But I will. Well, I'm curious, getting back to your 4 main players, was there a voice that came to you? You know, you just spoke to one that didn't come to you quite as naturally, one that I remember we talked about too, of like how to make this work. But I'm wondering, was there one that you just fell into where you're like, oh, I know this voice, and, you know, I know how to write from this perspective?
I think, like, fundamentally, I think Oona is kind of like the heart of the book, also because, yeah, she feels in so many ways, and the bit I just read is from her point of view. And I think so yeah, I won't say she like came easily, but I think she was kind of pretty fully formed. I think the flip side is, like, in the book she's 12 and she turns 13, and it's quite a, like, there were moments, like, she wasn't perfect when she first came out, because it is that weird in between moment of being, and like, you know, I have a niece who's 12, and it is that thing of being like somewhere between being a kid and being a teenager, and how that manifests, and obviously, especially if you live in like the rural countryside and you don't have a television or whatever, like, that also probably is different to someone who grows up in a city with a smartphone and a TV, etc. So I did probably, like, her age wavered slightly, but like in general, as a kind of as a character, she was pretty fully formed, and it's just great to write, because she's kind of a little weird feminist creature who kind of is like just going along with everything, and you know, just doing her own thing. So yeah, I like her a lot.
Oh my gosh, she had my heart from page one. I absolutely love Oona. And I think one of the things, and this was something that we did mark in edits, and I know James did too, but it's hard when you have a character on the cusp like that, 12 to 13, to not make them too precocious, to know too much, to also not make them know too little, that they're not interesting to follow as a voice, you know? And one of the things that I loved about actually all four of the voices of your main characters is that I think that there's such a great empathy in the prose for your characters. And I know that you've spoken about empathy in writing before, but I'm curious, you know, like when you read this, I can tell you are moved by your characters' predicaments. And I'm curious, like, what is one of the things that was like, as you're writing, especially when you're putting your characters through something difficult, you know, or something hard, was there a particular predicament where you're like, oh, like where you just felt for your characters? Because, you know, you're moving the things behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like a slightly different answer to your question, but like basically I have one character who like has a pretty dark past and has done some pretty bad stuff in his life. And I remember like a really early draft showing it to my husband, and he was reading it and he's like, Ruth, this guy's awful. But I was like, I guess because I had like spent so long getting under his skin, and like, yeah, he's done awful things, but he's really sorry for it now, and he's really remorseful, and he's turned a corner. And I guess like, not that I felt he was justified, but I kind of like wanted to hope that he was like on this path to being a better human. But my husband was like, no, he's done too much awful stuff, like you need to rein that back. So I had to edit him a little bit to make him slightly less awful of a creature. But I guess that was like surprised me, because obviously if I like read about some like a man like that in the news, I would just be like, evil, no. But because I had like spent time, as I said, getting under his skin and analyzing some of the reasons why he did the things he did, and crucially, as I said, how he feels about them now, I didn't hate him anymore, and I kind of, you know, I wanted to give him a chance. So so that was kind of an interesting one where I ended up making him like his past slightly less checkered, but I still think that he I definitely empathized with him, despite the fact that he is a bit sketch.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely characters that I'll spend time with in books that I wouldn't spend time with, you know, like in real life, you know, like that I would, and I sort of push against the idea. I get that you can't be reprehensible, right? You have to have some sort of redeeming, but sometimes I feel like there is a push to make characters sort of likable. You hear this a lot, especially, maybe this is not a fair statement, but a lot of times when there's like a female lead, she's got to be likable. You know, you have to be able to root for her. And I'm not sure, I wonder how you feel about that. But since you have, in all of your books, your 5 books, you have so many different characters, so many different levels of, you know, likability, or how people might, what do you think about writing do you think it's necessary to write a likable character for your audience?
No, and I totally get, and I agree that like it does feel super gendered, like that somehow the kind of female characters have to be likable, or have to be, there's like an obsession with kind of relatability at the moment that feels like super important. And also like I'm a bit like you, like not only are the people I will hang out with in books that I won't hang out with in real life, but sometimes I want to hang out with people in books that I don't hang out with in real life, especially at the moment, right? Because like the whole point of reading is to like expand your horizons, etc., etc. So someone that's like, oh my god, this book is so relatable, and it's just like my life on a page, I'm like, no thanks, like that's like the opposite of what I want. But yeah, I think the likability point is true, and as I said, I think it is. I think there is an obsession with you know, female characters having to be more likable. I think there's also like an additional thing to that, and this is like slightly going off topic, so we don't have to spend long on it, but like there's also a bit of a, not a trend, but a thing I've noticed also is that like sometimes there seems to be a trend also that like women characters especially have some kind of like trauma in their past that somehow therefore justifies XYZ. And sometimes I would just like the kind of the reason they do the things they do or are the people they are not because they were like damaged often by a man in their past, you know what I mean? Because that like obviously is a thing and is like, you know, more common than any of us would like it to be, but like that's just one reason that people are the way they are, and there are so many other reasons as well. So I think that's also seems to be like quite a common thing alongside the like a likable obsession.
Are you talking about sort of agency then, like giving characters more of a sense of agency? They don't have to fall on tropes to be certain ways, especially in fiction, you know, like having, I think that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that aspect of it. I have noticed, and I have noticed on the acquisition side of things, when looking at something that has a leading female character that might not be totally likable, you know, like I worked on a lot of Claire Fuller's books, and she's sort of famous for making a sort of unlikable female lead. There is pushback, like, well, who do you root for? And I'm like, I root for her anyway. Like,
yeah, whatever.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, we've talked a lot about your human characters, and so let's talk about cows. You know, what was the research that went into writing? I mean, I read last night, I went through and found, you know, a bunch of different scenes about cows, and they're so lovely. They're so detailed. I mean, did you put on your boots and head out into the fields and watch cows? Because that's kind of what it reads like.
Yeah, I think like I should like preface everything I say being like, I grew up in Dublin, I live in London, like I am very much like a city creature. So like I do not, I'm not from like a rural background or really interact. I didn't have any pets growing up. Like I wouldn't really describe myself as like an animal person. So then people are like, you write so lovingly about the cows. I'm like, well, that's good because that, you know, doesn't necessarily come naturally. But yeah, I did do, I mean, I did all sorts of research for this book, you know, in terms of kind of archives and watching, you know, old documentaries and news footage and libraries and you know, medical textbooks about mad cow disease and what it does to someone's brain. So it was pretty wide reaching, but there did come a point where I was like, I need to go to a farm. I need to go to a farm and I need to hang out with some farmers and some cows and really like get, you know, a feel for all of that. So my father, who, you know, as soon as you're like, I need to talk to such and such type of person, he'll be like, leave it with me, and he'll have like a friend of a friend or someone, he'll know a guy. So anyway, off we went on this road trip up to kind of the border counties where the novel is set. And I remember just going up there for the first time, and this lovely man had agreed that we could like take a nose around his farm and I could ask him questions. And like I really was, you know, like I wore my Wellington boots, like which I had only ever worn before to like go to Glastonbury. Like these had not experienced like real life farm before, and I was asking just like the most inane questions ever. I was like, what's that? He'd be like, that's a cow. So like it was just, I was so ignorant, but he was so patient with me and answered like all he answered all the silly questions. So yeah, that was useful. And then I also actually did a writing residency, like twice actually during the writing of this book, up in that part of the world as well. It was like the middle of nowhere, like properly remote. And I would just go for these like long walks, and literally it would just be like me and some cows just for miles around. And yeah, you kind of, you look at them and you make some notes and you really kind of commune with them. So I became kind of, sorry, also there's fireworks going on outside for no apparent reason. So just if you hear banging, I'm not getting shot, there's just some random fireworks. So yeah, I did form quite a love for the cows, which is useful because then when you bring out a novel that, you know, is about cattle, and in this instance has a beautiful drawing of a cow on the front, lots of people buy you cow themed gifts. So I now have like little figurines, I have like jewelry, I have, you know, t-shirts, all with various, you know, cow emblazoned on them. So I've got loads of cow merch, which is all one can ever hope for.
That's wonderful. It's so interesting that you talk about, you know, that's the first time you sort of put on your boots in a way to go to the farm, because there's such an intimacy, such a familiarity with farms and farm life. I grew up in rural Arkansas, and when I read this, I was like, oh, this person knows cows, and so that's really interesting. And I think that that's sort of like the act, right, of the role of the writer, getting in there and creating that. And it makes me think of, I read in an interview that you fainted while getting your ears pierced. And without giving too much away, you really don't shy away from violence or sharp points in this novel. And so do you have like a different stomach for writing than you do, like in the real world?
I can't believe that you found that. I mean, that is true, but like, wow, I cannot believe that exists somewhere on the internet, that I fainted when I got my ears pierced at age like 9. I did, it really hurts.
It does really hurt.
Yeah, no, I know, I would never do it again. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like, and this probably does kind of answer your question by proxy and possibly reveal that I'm like 2% of a psychopath, but like, I don't really, like, I don't think of this as like a violent book, or like, I don't, yeah, I know, this is where you're like, oh my God, she's crazy. Like, one person dies, spoiler, but like, that's, that really early on. So, and sure, like he dies in like a not totally pretty way, but yeah, I don't know. That just seemed like, yeah, I don't know why. And maybe the fact that like I'm so blasé about it and that wasn't difficult to write at all, as I said, probably does reveal something like relatively dark about me as a human. But let's not dwell on that. I just kind of went with it.
No, but I mean, there's definitely darkness as an underbelly in this work and in your characters. And I'm drawn to that too, as an editor, sort of these darker, harder questions, and I'm curious, this is your 5th book, right? So I'm curious if you definitely carry some themes through, in your characters, but I'm curious if there's anything that you've learned over writing, over the course of these books, or if there's anything that you feel like has changed, about you, or is it just project to project?
I mean, I do like, you say like it's, this is my 5th book. Like my first 3 books were written when I was like much younger. They were like super commercial, super autobiographical. Like they feel like another portion of my life, which like I, was great and was lovely, but feels pretty separate to like what I'm, with the last 2, for example. I think what's kind of struck me, my previous book, Nine Folds, Make a Paper Swan, was based around the history of the Jewish community in Ireland. And I guess it was, someone turned around to me and was like, wow, you must think about like religion and faith a lot. In a way that like that felt really obvious when I was writing about the Jewish community, because I was like explicitly learning about that community and analyzing it and immersing myself in it. But then this feels like such a different book, and yeah, if I take a step back, like it is, and I've already said it tonight, like it's about superstitions and the clash between religion and pagan stuff, and as someone who like is religious herself, like I guess I hadn't fully realize that seems to be like a recurring theme in 2 books, which to my mind on the face of it are like really quite different. So yeah, I clearly have a bit of an obsession with yeah, kind of wrangling with those literally big questions. I think other, in some ways, the thing I've learned almost is like not to panic if there isn't like a coherent through line. Like I feel like, in a really kind of trite nutshell, my previous book was about Irish Jews, and this one is about folklore and mad cow disease. Like it really is, they couldn't be more different. And I think I do have like a little bit of a magpie brain that just like sees it, like some idea, or as I said at the start, like that road trip I went on and those stories that my friend was telling me sparked something in my brain that like I don't know why or how, and that instinct, in many ways I should have ignored it because it seems so niche and such a random thing to like trigger a whole novel. But I think the only thing I am learning is to just kind of trust that instinct, not because like I'm really good at finding ideas. It's more just like, because as I said, I spent so long working on these books, like I spent kind of 3-4 years on each one. There has to be that kind of almost inexplicable, unnameable something that just like hooks you on and just makes you want to write about it, even if it kind of makes no sense or is super different to the thing you wrote before, or kind of seems almost like a bad idea. I think just to kind of trust that like it may hopefully lead somewhere good, and also if it is for some reason compelling you to keep going, then just go with it. So yeah, I think that's as much as I can offer.
No, that's interesting. Were there touchstone novels for this one that were inspirational to The Butcher's Blessing? I know that you've had Interweaver touchstones that you've talked about, but I'm curious if there's anything that you sort of lean on or inspired you.
Yeah, I think from like a kind of a practical point of view, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about the kind of even the knowledge of farm life and the cattle and blah blah blah. You know, a lot of that, as I said, came from going to farms and hanging out with cows. It also came from reading books. Like, you know, Ireland does have like an incredible wealth of wonderful novels published, you know, especially, you know, in the 20th century. But, you know, from John McGahern to Colm Tóibín, and, you know, these kind of beautiful novels set in the Irish countryside that are stunning and have just this atmosphere that just feels so perfect. So I definitely kind of read back through that canon, absolutely, although as I said, I was very mindful that like I wanted to do something similar, but like with a real kind of focus on female voices. There's also kind of, you know, contemporary female authors, particularly like someone like Evie Wilde or Sarah Hall, who I think, or even Daisy Johnson, who are like doing, you know, who are writing books that are, I won't say they're like, sometimes get described as like folk horror or contemporary gothic, or they just have that like slightly dark edge, and there is almost like a, you know, they tend to have like a slight simmering female rage just under the surface, which I like. So I think the kind of dark gothic-y female rage with the like lovely atmospheric Irish farm books, I would like to see this book as kind of a perfect, not perfect, it's not perfect, but like a mashup of those two very kind of different influences.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll open it up and start reading from the Q&A. So if there's anybody in the crowd, I see a lot of great familiar names in this crowd. Want to ask a question, you can put it in the Q&A section and I'll read it. Ruth and I will both be able to see it. But I'll ask just one more before we open it up. I think, you know, during the pandemic, many of us are sort of struggling on how best to organize our days. I mean, I know that you and I have had edit calls when you hear my son sort of yelling from me from the bathtub in our house. And, you know, many of us commute from our bed to our desk now, you know, and I'm curious, you know, how do you draw a line between spaces? How do you write while in lockdown? And I know that you're a professor with a full teaching load. Like, how do you find time to write this next book that I cannot wait to read?
I shouldn't have mentioned it.
No.
I guess like it, you know, that has differed quite a lot over, I think all of us, so I can organize the last crazy, you know, 8 months at this stage into like sections. So I feel like the last couple of months I haven't had loads of time to do any writing because, as you said, like the semester has started and I'm back to teaching full time, which involves some face-to-face teaching, some Zoom teaching, some pre-recording of lectures so that if I drop dead, my module can still go ahead, which is a really cheery thought. Thanks, guys. So navigating that, and also like having to put on lots of extra kind of pastoral care for my poor anxious students has kept me busy. So that's been kind of the focus for the last couple of months. But I guess before that, and especially over the summer, and that's where I did like a lot of the writing on the first draft of the new one, I am like quite, like I'm a routine person. Anyone, I think there's like a couple of family members on this call, and like if I wasn't in the room, they'd probably call me neurotic, but I'm sure if I was in the room, they'd be like, she's very organized. So, you know, two sides of the same coin. But my big thing is that like I wake up every morning quite early and I make myself a cup of tea and I go back to bed and I read for an hour. I read fiction for an hour. Some writers say they don't read at all when they're writing because they don't want to become like infected by other authors' voices. I can think of nothing better than to become infected by, I read strategically based on what I'm working on for stuff that I might want to infect me. But yeah, so I will then kind of read for an hour, and I find it a really great way to kind of wake up creatively almost and have my brain engage with the world through fiction, and then I will come in here. This is the room in which I spend like so much time. This is the second bedroom in our flat in London, and I will sit down here and then I will just start writing for the day. And I think I'm really lucky that I have the space. My poor husband has been relegated to the kitchen table because I'm like, this is mine. But having that routine and as I said, waking up that way and starting each day like that, I just find it, as I said, helps me get into a great routine. And also like I plan everything. I plan from like my days, my weeks, my new novel. Like I have lists and to-do lists and plans coming out of my ears, because I think, and especially at the moment when time just feels like one vast expanse, that feels really necessary. So I'm as organized as ever.
I love the idea of getting ready to write by reading other writers. I think that's really smart. All right, we have a couple questions and we only have a short amount of time, so I'm going to jump into it. But kind of a fun question from Josh Glancy. How did writing The Butcher's Blessing affect your attitude to beef? Did you eat more or less steaks since writing this book?
That is a very good question, Josh. Thank you. It's quite funny. Like, I mean, I lied earlier when I said the first question people always ask me about this novel is whether the butchers are real. Actually, the first question people always ask is, "Ooh, will I like it?" Because I'm a vegetarian. And again, that like sort of makes me smile, because to my mind, this is not a book, despite the title and despite the world in which it's set. Like no cows get harmed in making of this book. Like there aren't like endless scenes of like cows getting killed. I can promise you that. So yeah, I mean, I would say that like over the period of writing the book, like I eat less meat and have a more plant-based diet. But I think that's also just the fact that like I'm a millennial, and that over the last few years I feel like everyone has made that transition also. So we can like we can blame the book, but we'll never be able to separate how much is just like the zeitgeist and how much was the writing of the book. So yeah.
That's great. We have one from Jan O'Connell who says, "Hi Ruth, we are very proud of you." And then a quick question. Why was the name of the book changed from The Butchers in the UK to The Butcher's Blessing in the USA? And this is from Jan and Tim.
Yeah, so those, for full disclosure, those are my in-laws. So they're part of the list of people who would refer to me as organized and not neurotic. And this, Masie, my good friend, is where I'm going to ask you to help out with this answer, because this is also a question I always get asked about this edition. So for the American folk in the audience, I suppose, in the UK and Ireland, the book is just called The Butchers, but over here, or over there in America, it's called The Butcher's Blessing. And Masie, I guess, yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to speak to that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you even have the UK copy with you in Arm's Reach, but if you don't, that's fine. But one of the things is that there were other books similarly titled here. And another reason was just to sort of open it up a little bit, because there was that, we didn't want it to fall into a strictly thriller category. And so the idea there was to bring in sort of the lyricism, the literary fictionness of this. And so I think The Butcher's Blessing, we had such a long list, we were talking about this earlier, Ruth, of possible titles. It started to look like a song album, like titles, just like tracks and tracks and tracks of them. But I love The Butcher's Blessing. I think it brings in, the curse and the idea of these 8 men sort of trying to undo the widow's curse. I thought it was just a beautiful way in. And really quickly, while I have you guys, because I hadn't told Ruth this, but the artist who drew these cows, these are actually woodblock cutouts of cows, is like a 19-year-old ranch hand named Rio. And he was so thrilled to be the cover artist for Ruth's book. But then we sort of joked in-house at Tin House that his family was going to be worried because he's, you know, a ranch hand and now he's going to art school. So this is kind of a wonderful story with that. But yeah, I think two very different packages in the US and UK, two different titles. Hopefully not confusing, but just that's the story behind it.
No, I think it's like, it's definitely even by adding that one word and that one apostrophe that, you know, some people like to put in various locations, but it softens it and it makes it, yeah, I think it has been interesting to see the reaction in the UK that people, something about Just the Butchers, they're like, oh, is it like, yeah, is it a very violent book? Which, like, further to our conversation, like, I really don't think it is. So I think it's been interesting, just that slight tweak definitely makes it like a little softer.
All right, we have time, I think, for maybe one or two more. We have one from Deborah Leonard. Ruth, you mentioned a canon of male Irish writers who write of the countryside. Are there key female characters in those novels? And how important was it for you to have Oona, to insert Oona into that landscape?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, great question, by the way. In terms of, you know, the male Irish canon, I should say, like, there are some great Irish female writers who were writing and kind of rural novels as well. I think, you know, the most kind of famous example, of course, is Edna O'Brien. And I think what she did for Irish women writers, and, you know, when she was first publishing in kind of the 60s and the 70s, and the scandal around her books, because she was writing books that were set in kind of rural Ireland, but were about women with, like, you know, desires and who liked sex and that sort of thing, and they were, like, you know, they were censored, they were banned, there was an outcry. So I think she was definitely, I think, the kind of the main example of someone who did first say, you know what, this is a very male dominated, well, country, and therefore canon, and it's about time that we put an end to that. But, you know, there have been other writers since then who, like, thanks to O'Brien having paved the way, were able to get those Irish female voices out there. But, you know, again, going back to the likes of kind of Evie Wilde and Sarah Hall and these British authors I love, you know, I didn't feel like that, you know, I can't think of examples of Irish writers who were doing that same kind of folk horror, gothic, dark thing with the landscape, which is what I wanted to try and do. So yeah, all hail Edna for kind of starting the ball rolling. And it's fun now to take that in different directions.
That's great. All right, we have just a minute left. So I'll give you one last quick question that I think is a nice one to wrap it with, which is, what book should you read before The Butcher's Blessing, and what book should you read after? And that's from Yashwina Cantor. Hi, Yashwina.
Do you mean like any book, or?
I think any book. What would you recommend? Fine. Sort of as like an appetizer and then a, you know, following.
I think I would just have to recommend, oh my God, there's just so many. I would say, to go back to the authors that I keep mentioning, I think Evie Wilde, her book, All the Birds Singing, is, like, I think, an absolute masterpiece, and you'll probably read it and then be like, Ruth, were you influenced by her just a little bit? And yes, unashamedly I was, because I think she's incredible. And then a novel by Sarah Hall called The Wolf Border, which is also set in a border, but the border between England and Scotland, and it's set in kind of the rural landscape there, and it's all about reintroducing wolves into the landscape there. So it's got a lot of similar stuff going on in terms of that kind of weird in between barren landscape, animals, violence, female rage, the whole kit and caboodle. It's brilliant. So that's The Wolf Border by Sarah Hall.
I love that. Well, thank you, Ruth, for coming here and talking with me, and thank you, Car, for hosting and Green Apple Books. We couldn't do what we do without you. Independent bookstores chose The Butcher's Blessing as an indie next pick in this November. So wonderful, and if you haven't read it yet, do. It's amazing. So thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Car.
Yes, thanks also from me, Car. This is such a treat to have been here, and yeah, it's just such a lovely occasion, as I said, the week that the book came out in America, to be doing this in a bookshop that I visited and adored. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much. It's been our total pleasure. Thank you for a great conversation. Thank you to everyone out there who joined us for your very considered questions and for both of your very considered answers. I'll just show the audience this book one last time in case they haven't seen it. Which is gorgeous. I do love the cover, and it's perfect for this season. So if you haven't read Ruth's book yet, absolutely pick it up. Thank you both again for a lovely conversation. We appreciate it. And congratulations, Ruth.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Bye, everybody.